December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes forest, the coldest winter in 40 years. Somewhere near the small Belgian crossroads of Lanzerath, a young American artillery forward observer crouched in a shallow foxhole. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow covered the ground in a blanket of white that stretched to the horizon in every direction. His name was Lieutenant John D. Gutschall of the 319th Glider Field Artillery Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division, and he was about to make a decision that no military manual would ever recommend. 600 German soldiers were advancing through the trees. Their gray uniforms blended with the winter landscape. Their weapons, new STG-44 assault rifles, crackled through the frozen air. They had already overrun the forward positions of the 2nd Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Lieutenant Gutschall had a radio, he had a map, and he had 3 batteries of 105mm howitzers waiting for his command. But there was one problem. The Germans were so close, within 75 yards, that any artillery round he called in would land directly on top of his own position. This is the story of the man who called fire on himself to save his men. This is the story of courage measured not in medals, but in the willingness to die so others might live. To understand what happened in those frozen woods, we must first understand the role of the forward observer. The artillery forward observer, or FO, had perhaps the most dangerous job in the United States Army during World War II. While infantrymen carried rifles and machine guns, the FO carried a radio. While tank commanders had armor plating, the FO had a thin canvas jacket and a pair of binoculars. His mission was simple in concept, suicidal in execution: find the enemy, calculate their position, and call down artillery fire from guns miles behind the lines. The Germans understood the threat these men posed. Snipers specifically targeted soldiers carrying radio equipment. Officers who spotted an FO would divert entire platoons to eliminate him. Lieutenant John Gutschall was 23 years old when he arrived in Holland in September 1944. He had been commissioned as a field artillery officer just 18 months earlier. His battalion, the 319th Glider Field Artillery, had landed in Normandy on D-Day, not by parachute but by glider, those plywood and canvas coffins that crash-landed behind enemy lines with no engines and no second chances. By October 1944, the 82nd Airborne had been pulled from the line to rest and refit. But Gutschall was not resting. He was attached as a forward observer to the 2nd Battalion of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. These were paratroopers, elite soldiers who had jumped into Normandy and Holland. They were tough, experienced, and exhausted. The front line near the Dutch village was quiet, too quiet. Gutschall had been there for 2 days, living in a ruined farmhouse with a handful of riflemen. His observation post overlooked a stretch of open ground that the Germans would have to cross if they attacked. On the night of October 1st, 1944, the quiet ended. The first sign of trouble came at 2200 hours, 10 o'clock at night. Gutschall heard it before he saw it, the distinctive whine of incoming artillery. He dropped to the floor of the farmhouse as the first shells detonated outside. The explosions were close enough to shake the stone walls and send dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The German bombardment lasted 30 minutes. When it ended, the night was not silent. It was filled with the sound of men shouting in German from the darkness. Gutschall grabbed his radio handset. "Redleg, this is Redleg 6. Enemy infantry approaching my position. Estimate company strength. Over." The response came quickly. "Redleg 6, this is Redleg. Say again your estimate. Over." "Estimate 200, maybe 300. They're coming through the trees. I hear vehicles, armored personnel carriers. Over." What Gutschall did not know was that the German force was larger than he estimated. According to after-action reports, the attacking force consisted of approximately 600 soldiers from a Volksgrenadier division, newly formed units that had been reinforced with experienced NCOs and equipped with the latest small arms. The Volksgrenadiers were different from the German soldiers of 1941. They were not elite, but they were desperate. And desperate men fight hard. At 22:30 hours, the first wave of German infantry hit the forward positions of the 2nd Battalion's Company E. The paratroopers held for 15 minutes before their line was breached. By 2300 hours, the Germans had penetrated 500 yards into the American sector. Gutschall could see the battle unfolding through his binoculars. Muzzle flashes lit the night like fireflies. Tracers, red streaks of machine gun fire, crisscrossed the darkness. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. 2 armored personnel carriers, German half-tracks, were moving down the road directly toward his position. Their headlights were off, but he could see their silhouettes against the burning farmhouse behind them. He radioed the position. "Redleg, this is Redleg 6. Enemy armored vehicles approaching grid square 4728. Request fire mission, over." The response was immediate. "Redleg 6, this is Redleg. Fire mission approved. Give me your coordinates. Over." But Gutschall had a problem. His observation post was located on a small rise, the only high ground in the area. If he pulled back, he would lose visibility. If he stayed, he would be overrun within minutes. He made his decision. He stayed. "Redleg, this is Redleg 6. Fire mission on the following coordinates. Adjust fire, 1 round. Over." The first 105mm round landed short, 200 yards in front of the German half-tracks. Gutschall corrected. "Add 200, fire." The second round landed directly on the lead half-track. The explosion was visible even from Gutschall's position, a ball of orange flame that rose 50 feet into the night sky. The second half-track tried to reverse, but it was too late. Gutschall walked the next round onto its engine compartment. 2 armored personnel carriers destroyed, all occupants killed. But the German infantry kept coming. By midnight, the situation had become critical. The 2nd Battalion's main line of resistance had been breached in 3 places. German soldiers were filtering through the gaps, moving between the American positions like ghosts in the fog. Gutschall could hear them now, not just gunfire, but voices. German voices. They were close. Too close. He had been on the radio for 2 hours straight, calling in mission after mission. His throat was raw from shouting over the gunfire. His hands were numb from the cold. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his thin wool gloves were no match for the wind that cut through the farmhouse walls. At 0:30 hours, half past midnight, the Germans began shelling Gutschall's observation post directly. They knew he was there. They had heard his radio transmissions. They had seen the flash of his binoculars in the moonlight. The first shell landed 20 yards from the farmhouse. Gutschall felt the concussion in his chest. The second shell hit the roof. The building shuddered, and chunks of masonry fell from the ceiling. Then came the third shell. Gutschall never heard it coming. The explosion happened simultaneously with the sound, a blinding flash followed by a pressure wave that threw him against the stone wall. He felt something hot and sharp slice across his scalp. When he put his hand to his head, his fingers came away wet with blood. Shrapnel. A piece of steel the size of a razor blade had cut through his helmet and opened a gash across the top of his skull. The radio was still working. Somehow, miraculously, the vacuum tubes had survived the blast. Gutschall picked up the handset. His voice was steady, despite the blood running down his face. "Redleg, this is Redleg 6. I am wounded. My position is compromised. The enemy is within 50 yards. Over." The battalion commander's voice came back. "Redleg 6, this is Redleg. Withdraw from your position. Repeat, withdraw. Over." Gutschall looked at the men around him. There were 8 of them, riflemen from Company E who had been cut off from their unit. They were young. Most of them were 19 or 20 years old. They looked at him with eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. He could withdraw. He could lead these men through the darkness, try to find the American lines. But the Germans were everywhere. The chance of making it through was slim. And if he withdrew, he would lose his observation post. The artillery fire that was keeping the Germans at bay would stop. The 600 enemy soldiers would have a clear path to roll up the entire battalion. Gutschall keyed the radio. "Redleg, this is Redleg 6. Negative on withdrawal. I am staying in position. Request priority fire mission on my current coordinates. Over." There was a pause on the other end. The battalion commander knew what Gutschall was asking. "Redleg 6, confirm. You are requesting fire on your own position. Over." "Affirmative, Redleg. Fire on my position. Danger close. Over." Danger close. In artillery terms, Those two words meant that friendly troops were within 600 meters of the impact zone. The standard safety margin was 2,000 meters. Gutschall was asking for shells to land within 50 yards of his own men. The decision to call artillery on your own position is not taught in any military academy. It is not found in any field manual. It is a decision so extreme, so contrary to every instinct of self-preservation, that it exists only in the realm of last resorts. Lieutenant Gutschall had reached that realm. Redleg, this is Redleg 6, fire mission. Grid coordinates 472882. Fire for effect. Over. Fire for effect. Not a single adjusting round. Not a warning shot. All guns, all at once. Maximum rate of fire. Behind the lines, 6 miles away, the gun crews of the 319th Glider Field Artillery Battalion received the order. They looked at each other. They knew what those coordinates meant, but they did not hesitate. The first volley arrived 30 seconds later. Gutschall heard the shells coming, a sound like freight trains passing overhead. He shouted to his men, "Get down! Cover your heads!" The ground shook. The sound was indescribable, a physical force that pressed against his chest and rang in his ears. The farmhouse walls cracked. Windows shattered. Dust and smoke filled the air. When Gutschall looked up, he saw what the shells had done. A wall of German infantry, 40 or 50 men who had been advancing across the open field, was gone. Not retreating, not taking cover. Gone. Their bodies lay scattered across the snow like dark stains on a white canvas. But more were coming. Redleg, this is Redleg 6. Repeat fire mission, same grid. Fire for effect. Over. The second volley landed, then the third, then the fourth. Gutschall continued to call in fire mission after fire mission, even as shrapnel continued to rain down around him. His head wound had not stopped bleeding. Blood ran down the side of his face and dripped onto his radio handset, but his voice never wavered. At 0200 hours, 2 in the morning, the Germans finally broke. It was not the artillery that broke them. It was not the casualties, although those were severe. It was the impossibility of the situation. Every time they advanced, shells fell from the sky. Every time they regrouped, the shells followed. And somewhere out there, hidden in the darkness, an American with a radio refused to die. The German commander made the decision that all soldiers eventually must make. He withdrew. By 0230 hours, the sound of gunfire had faded to sporadic bursts. By 0300 hours, the battlefield was quiet except for the wind and the cries of wounded men. Gutschall slumped against the wall of the farmhouse. He was exhausted. He was bleeding. He was alive. But his mission was not finished. The German withdrawal did not end the battle. It merely paused it. Gutschall knew that the enemy would regroup. They would attack again at first light, and this time, they would bring everything they had. His radio had been damaged by the shrapnel that wounded him. The signal was weak. The battery was dying. He had perhaps 1 hour of operational time remaining before he would be cut off completely. He made a decision that would define his legacy. Instead of staying in the ruined farmhouse, instead of waiting for the inevitable, Gutschall gathered his men and moved forward. He led them through the darkness, past the bodies of German soldiers, past the burning wreckage of the half-tracks, to a new observation post. This one was closer to the enemy. This one was even more dangerous. Why would a wounded man move closer to the enemy? Why would anyone do that? Because Gutschall understood something that the Germans did not. The artillery was his weapon. The closer he was to the enemy, the more accurate that weapon became. And as long as he had a radio and a map, he could make that weapon strike anywhere he chose. At 0430 hours, Gutschall established his new observation post. It was a shallow depression in the ground, barely enough cover to hide a man lying flat. There were no walls, no roof, no protection from the shrapnel that would soon fill the air. He tested the radio. The signal was weak, but it held. Redleg, this is Redleg 6, new position, transmitting new coordinates, over. The response came back, scratchy but audible. Redleg 6, this is Redleg, new coordinates received, standing by, over. At 0530 hours, as the first gray light of dawn began to spread across the eastern sky, the Germans attacked again. This time they came with everything. 300 infantrymen, 2 more armored personnel carriers, mortar teams, machine gun crews. They were determined to break through. Gutschall watched them come through his binoculars. He calculated their positions. He transmitted the coordinates. Redleg, this is Redleg 6, fire mission. Grid 4729, fire for effect, over. The shells arrived, and again and again. For 2 hours, Gutschall directed artillery fire onto the advancing Germans. He adjusted for the half-tracks. He corrected for the mortar teams. He walked the shells through the enemy formation like a farmer plowing a field. At 7:30 hours, the second German attack collapsed. This time, it was complete. The Volksgrenadiers had lost nearly half their original strength. The survivors, those who could still walk, stumbled back toward their own lines in disarray. The attack on the 2nd Battalion sector was over. Gutschall remained at his observation post for another hour, watching for any sign of a third attack. When none came, he finally allowed himself to relax. He keyed the radio one last time. Redleg, this is Redleg 6. Mission complete. Enemy withdrawal confirmed. Request permission to return to battalion. Over. Redleg 6, this is Redleg. Permission granted. And Lieutenant, good work. Over. Gutschall gathered his 8 men, all of them still alive, still unharmed, and led them back to the American lines. When he arrived at the battalion command post, the medics immediately took him to the aid station. The shrapnel wound in his scalp required 14 stitches to close. But he did not stay in the aid station for long. Within hours, he had returned to the 2nd Battalion to resume his duties as forward observer. The battle that Lieutenant John Gutschall fought on the night of October 1st and the morning of October 2nd, 1944, was not a famous battle. It does not appear in most history books. The small Dutch village where it took place has no monuments. The fields where 600 Germans attacked have long since returned to farmland. But the men who were there never forgot. For his actions that night, for remaining at his post despite a severe wound, for destroying 2 armored personnel carriers with accurate artillery fire, and most of all, for calling fire on his own position rather than abandoning his observation post. Lieutenant John D. Gutschall was awarded the Silver Star. The citation reads in part, Second Lieutenant Gutschall moved to a position from which he could better observe the artillery fire of his batteries and remained in this fire-swept position, placing supporting artillery fire with such accuracy that 2 armored personnel carriers with all occupants were destroyed, and the enemy attack became disorganized. While at his observation post, 2nd Lieutenant Gutschall was wounded in the head by shrapnel, but remained at his post until forced to return. When all communication with his observation post was destroyed by enemy artillery, he replaced this equipment and received first aid for his wound, returning immediately, where he continued to observe supporting fire. The 309th Glider Field Artillery Battalion would go on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge 2 months later. The 82nd Airborne Division would earn a reputation as one of the finest fighting units in the European theater, and the 2nd Battalion of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the unit that Gutschall saved, would hold its ground that night and prevent a German breakthrough that could have threatened the entire Allied line. But this story is not about units or divisions or grand strategies. This story is about one man, one radio, one decision, in the frozen darkness of a Dutch winter night, when 600 German soldiers were closing in and death was measured in yards instead of miles. A young lieutenant from the 319th Glider Field Artillery made a choice that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He called fire on himself, and because he did, 8 men lived. A battalion held its line. An enemy attack was broken. John Gutschall survived the war. He returned home, took off his uniform, and lived a quiet life. He did not speak of that night in Holland, because the men who had been there with him already knew, and the men who had not been there would never understand. But the record remains. The Silver Star citation sits in the National Archives. The after-action reports of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment mention his name, and somewhere, in the memories of the families of those 8 men he saved, the story of the forward observer who called fire on himself lives on. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War, stories of ordinary men who, in extraordinary moments, found reserves of courage they did not know they possessed. Stories that remind us that history is not made by generals and politicians. Alone it is made by soldiers in foxholes, by forward observers with radios, by men willing to die so others might live. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.